So we're going to get started. I just want to thank everyone who is attending. If this is your first time attending one of our events, I just want you to know this is put on by Washingtonians for Public Banking. We are a nonprofit advocacy organization in Washington State that fights for public banking at all levels of government. This is part of our virtual town hall series where twice bi-monthly, so every 2 months, we have an outside speaker come and talk to people who are interested in our organization about an issue related to banking, finance, or investments here in Washington State. Um, this will be our last virtual town hall for the year. We do have a meeting next month, which is going to be our coalition meeting where we're going to be talking about preparing for the next legislative session. We are recording this virtual town hall. All our virtual town halls are located on our YouTube channel where you can go back and watch events. I'm going to be pasting the information in chat, which includes our information about our website, whoever's new to the organization, our YouTube channel, if you want to look at past events, contact information if you want to get a hold of me or anyone else from the organization, and then information about upcoming coalition meeting about legislative session. My name is Marco Rosero Rossi. I am the Executive Director for Washingtonians for Public Banking. And I am very pleased to announce our speaker for today, Dr. Greg Goodall. Dr. Greg Goodall is the author of Strategic Methods for Tribal Economic Development, Creating Sustainable Prosperity in Native American Communities. For the past 30 years, Dr. Goodall's legal practice has supported Native American tribes, municipalities, and businesses with strategic planning and economic development. And without further ado, I hand it over to Dr. Goodall. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Marco, and thank you everyone for making time for us to be together this evening. And first, for everyone in Washington and wherever you might be, if you're on the Pacific Coast, I wish everyone just safety in the time of the heavy weather that we're having there. And I appreciate that under those circumstances, you're here with us tonight. So thank you very much. It's a real pleasure for me to be with you also, not only for this topic, which is something, as you'll see, I've been working on specifically in the Native American context for a while, but I myself raised in Snohomish, Washington, and so for all of you who are from or around Snohomish County, special hello and very much appreciate you bringing me into your meeting tonight. So I'm going to share my screen. We have a presentation, and for anyone who would like copies of this, I've provided this to Marco, so you'll be able to access it that way. And then at the end of the presentation, I've got my contact information, and I'm delighted to have further conversations with everybody. So please feel free. Let me get it. There we go. How does that look, Marco? Can you see
Oh, it
my
looks
screen?
great. It looks
Okay,
perfect.
super. Thank you. And if ever anyone's having trouble hearing me or anything, please let me know. I want to make sure that I'm being as clear on this as possible. But what we'll be talking about this evening, and I'll be speaking for 40, 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for your questions and discussion, and I look forward to that, is an innovative enterprise that has now come to life out on the East Coast, and it is the first tribal public bank in the United States of America. And this is a many years long process that is now really just kind of starting to come off the launch pad, but is fully fledged from the legal perspective and is now going into the operational mode with the tribe that is located. They are the only federally recognized tribe in the state of South Carolina, is the Catawba Nation. So they are the tribe that I worked with to put this idea together, to build it out, to adopt the legislation and regulations that would underline a public bank that is organized and operated under tribal law in a Native American jurisdiction. They now have their banking commission with some very prestigious and experienced commissioners who are leading the effort and who will regulate the public bank and do a number of things that are designed specifically, as the people here in our meeting tonight know, that a public bank can do to really fortify an economy and to create economic opportunity, to help smooth out some of the unevenness in our typical financial system and markets where there are winners and losers, and there are people who get whatever they need, and a lot of people who don't get even some of the basic things they need. The public bank of the Catawba Nation is designed to make the financial services sector work for the community and to provide capital and other financial tools and resources that enable people to improve their quality of life and hopefully create a virtuous cycle and accomplish things that are, particularly in rural communities and especially tribal communities, seem to be disappearing in terms of resources for banks. There was about a year ago a report that was issued by the United States Treasury Department talking about the disappearance of banks from America's rural communities. Um, Having grown up in Snohomish, we always had a couple of bank branches in town, but in farm communities like that all through the country, those banks are closing up shop. They just don't find it profitable enough to operate in small towns, and most tribal communities never had a bank, so they were going to those small towns for their banking, and now their bank is gone as well. So there is a dramatic need in our country, despite the news we hear about a robust economy, to try to even out the financial services sector. And for these communities that commercial banks don't find to be profitable, the public bank, in my view, and in the view of the people who have put together this project that we'll be discussing, see that as a real solution. And that's what we're working now to implement. So before we go into the details of the bank itself, I want to talk about how this got started and the underlying research and legal and political information that's the foundation for the Native American Public Bank. And the research effort really started, it's amazing how fast time flies, but it's over 10 years ago when I was working in the University of Washington Jackson School of International Studies with a research focus on political economy, which is typically viewed in the global context or the national context. We're talking about America or Europe, but often is not discussed in the context of America's tribal nations. But they are, in fact, nations in the classical sense, and this is something that's not well understood, unfortunately, throughout a lot of America. But our view is that tribes need to be thinking of themselves in that way. And when they think of their economic development needs and opportunities, and how the tribal government can interact in that space and do things that are beneficial, that is a political economy, the intersection of government and economic activity. So we really focused at the Jackson School on looking at how traditional political economy is analyzed, how those concepts could be applied to Native American nations, and then how the unique circumstances of Native American tribes could adapt to the idea of political economy and bring things forward. So the research that we did in those 3 years was published in 2016. There's a reference here that you can find this article online, and it's in the American Indian Law Review called Capital Inequality and Self-Determination: Creating a Sovereign Financial System for Native American Nations. What this article does is really lay out in detail the theoretical basis for how a tribe can operate its economic, financial, and in this case, banking systems, just like the United States government does. That they have that authority, they have that sovereign power as a governmental body to establish and regulate and charter these types of financial institutions. So when you're looking for the things that say, well, how can a tribe do this? This article goes into a lot of depth, and we won't cover it tonight, but you can use this as a reference. And again, this presentation will be available for you. So from that basis, when that article was published, I got in touch with the Catawba Nation, which has very interesting history. All Native American tribes have some things in common, but they all have some very unique historical and developmental aspects. And what the Catawba Nation can trace, being located out on the East Coast, they can show a history as a united population, community, and political entity going back thousands of years. They were one of the first tribes that was interacting with Spanish explorers when they were coming in the 15th century. And they were a federally recognized tribe here in the United States up until the first part of the 20th century. And then the United States government launched what is collectively known as the termination era, where it was really going away from the idea that we were going to have tribes anymore and was terminating those relationships. So the Catawba Nation, unfortunately, had its federal recognition terminated and for decades fought to get that back. And finally, in the 1990s, they restored and won that battle and got federal recognition back. So they are once again a tribe recognized and in partnership with the United States. But in the 1990s, they really found themselves starting from square one. They had just a tiny piece of land in that North South Carolina border area that we saw on the map. They had really no resources. They were not located near some of the bigger cities that provide markets and customers and things for retail traditional businesses. So they had to start getting creative and think, what are we going to do to build an economy? And what is available to us as far as resources, technologies, legal strategies, and everything. And they were really looking at it in a very fresh way. And they were certainly blessed with some very forward-thinking, very smart and hardworking people who took to the task. And what they came up with as an idea, which just very coincidentally meshed with the research we'd done at the University of Washington, was the creating of an enterprise zone, a special economic zone within the tribe's reservation. And they called it a digital economic zone because one of the biggest challenges for almost all tribes in America is geographic separation from markets and major centers of commerce. And that's been something that's held back economic development for tribes for generations. But right around this time, the 90s, and then we come into the 21st century, we have the telecommunications and internet revolution. We have the ability to communicate and transact business from anywhere to anywhere, as long as you've got the appropriate computers and connections. And that's something they were working on as far as their infrastructure. And once that was up, they realized, look, we may not be next to a big city, we may not be next to a major highway, but with the digital technology and connectivity we can build, we can pair that with a sovereign economic jurisdiction that is designed to be economy forward and be able to then offer a jurisdiction where businesses can operate in a way that is perhaps more favorable, more efficient to them than in the surrounding state jurisdiction, where they have restrictions, laws, red tape, and things like that. The most successful case study for doing that on the tribal side that really everyone's familiar with are tribal casinos. In the state of Washington, state of Oklahoma, all throughout the United States, Las Vegas style casino gambling is illegal under state law. And yet we drive around and we see dozens, if not hundreds, of casinos throughout these states, all of which are located on tribal land. And how that got started is with the passing of a law, with the exercise of sovereignty by the Native American tribe to say, we're going to pass our own tribal law operative within our jurisdiction on the reservation that says this economic activity of gaming is lawful if it's conducted in accordance with our regulations and under our supervision. So by doing that, they create an immediate opportunity to attract investment, to attract partnerships that in the past they themselves were never able to reach. And nowhere else in the state on non-tribal land can anyone else access either because it's not lawful. So that's how these tribal casinos have really built a pathway of economic success, is to take the political economy idea of pairing governmental power with a push for economic development, passing tribal laws that enable and regulate specific economic activity, and then using that as a competitive advantage to attract certain types of business, certain types of investment and partnerships so that you can build out the economy. Now, what Catawba did once they had come across the research that was published from our University of Washington work, they said, we want to create a zone that's going to do business of all kind. We want to be a tribal Dubai or a tribal Delaware. We want to become a corporate destination where we will be offering an advantageous, sort of very digitally focused, very modern and forward-looking and efficient, low fee, low tax environment to generate business. And we want to have it be broad. It's not just for casino gaming. In fact, we don't really do that here because of where they're located. They wanted it to be something where companies all over the United States, all over the world, would come and register an enterprise in their domicile and be able to do business. So we worked on that with them for several years, and then the underlying theories and basic strategy of that was published in the University of Tulsa School of Law's Tulsa Law Review in 2022. And your reference for that article is there too. These are free to access on the internet. So here you can see exactly what the Catawba Nation has done in creating a foundation legally for their political economy to give themselves the ability to create businesses and things like the public bank, which we'll now talk about in detail. And this is now up and running, and I'll show you at the end of the presentation the website for the Catawba Digital Economic Zone. It's absolutely fascinating what they've created. But all of the research conclusions and the publications that we've done have really come down to one particular theory, and that is that tribal governments must operationalize their sovereignty by enacting laws to govern economic activity and replacing federal and state governance. You've probably all heard the saying that America is a nation of laws. And in a practical standpoint, what that means is wherever somebody is in our country and whatever they're doing, there is some law that applies. If a town doesn't have a law on some subject, the county law applies. If the county doesn't have a law on that subject, then the state law applies. And if the state doesn't have a law on that subject, then federal law applies. So there's never a gap there where there's the Wild West and no law applies to what somebody's doing. Tribes are in that same mix. If a tribe doesn't have its own tribal law regulating an activity within its reservation, it doesn't mean there's no law on that. It means that that activity within the tribe's land is governed by either federal, state, or some combination of the two, those laws and regulations. And as anyone from tribal experience will tell you, those laws were not written from the tribal perspective. They were not written with the needs and priorities of tribes in mind, and usually they do not serve those interests very strongly. So, what we've been advocating for tribes to do is to recognize, yes, you have sovereignty. Yes, you are nations with that kind of national power of governance. But having sovereignty is kind of like having oil or gold under the ground. It doesn't really do you any good until you bring it up and put it to work. And the way governments govern is through laws. You think of how much the United States Congress and the legislature in Olympia and Washington State, they work year round on laws. Tribes typically have only a tiny fraction of the laws that their surrounding state governments and certainly the federal governments have. And so there are these huge gaps that are not allowing them to regulate their own activities, economic or otherwise, and also not giving them opportunities to create competitive advantages. So really that's the thrust of what Catawba is doing is to put this into practice. They have now enacted laws that govern their activity, and there are many benefits to doing that for tribes. And probably everyone on this call is familiar. The aggregate economic statistics for Native American communities are depressingly below the national averages in almost every category. Their rates of unemployment and poverty are distressingly high. And those economic problems create a whole host of social ills as well. And development really is difficult. And once a tribe, though, takes control and tries to overcome those barriers by implementing its own laws, you've got a lot of opportunity there. Sovereignty really is a powerful thing. And being able to make your own rules in your land and create advantages that way really does work. And it doesn't just work for casinos, but it can work in many different ways. It's also an opportunity for things to happen based on the special relationship between tribes and the federal government, because that is a treaty-based government to government relationship that's different from the relationship with the state governments and offers tribes some very special opportunities. And certainly that's something when we talk about banking and the idea of a public bank and how that needs to interact with America's financial system, that federal relationship is key. And we'll come back in a little bit and talk about how the Catawba Nation is specifically working on that issue. So, why should tribes get involved in regulating banking and finance? Why should they be concerned about that? There's lots of things happening at the federal and state levels on it. What difference does it make for a tribe to now try to get into that? So, this slide is sort of the who's who of financial catastrophes that we've experienced here in the last couple of years. These are just some of the banks and other types of institutions that have gone under, that have severely damaged not only their depositors and shareholders, but entire communities that relied on what these institutions do. And when those institutions fail for whatever reason, it's not just the business that fails, it's the communities that are connected with it. And when these banks and these investment companies have gone down, it's harmed tribes. Tribes throughout the country have had the kind of economic fallout from these failures that is really damaging to them because they can least afford it. It's hardest on those who have the least in the first place. And so when something like this happens, it's devastating. And so the risk factor of this is one reason why tribal governments need to think seriously about getting involved in oversight. But the other thing is, by the time we read about one of these institutional failures in the newspaper, it's too late to do anything about it. The ship has hit the iceberg. There's no way to really do anything except try to salvage whatever you can. But regulators like the FDIC, the Fed, the state in Washington, the Department of Financial Institutions, they get information from the institutions they regulate in advance and in more detail than the rest of us do. So they have the ability to spot warning signs of illegal activity, of a drop in capital, of the other things that end up causing bank and institutional failures like these faster than the rest of us would. So if a tribe is in a regulatory position and it's got the ability at its on a regular basis and at its own discretion to do audits, to go in and look at the books and understand what's happening in these institutions, that gives them the ability to take earlier action, to put out warnings, to ask for information, to tell people, hey, you maybe want to think about making some adjustments, and then have a chance to do something before it's too late. And every government, when we think about it, whether it's a national government around the world or all 50 of our state governments, they all regulate the financial industry. And so for tribes, again, to be nations with sovereign power, that's where they need to be. If they have people who have money in banks, and they certainly do, and they themselves as tribal governments and enterprises do, they need to be playing in that league and they need to be thinking in these terms and regulating it. And certainly, again, by creating efficient regulations, they have the opportunity to create competitive advantages. I remember this was years ago now, being absolutely shocked when I read that most of America's biggest banks, the Chase and the Citibanks, were domiciled in the state of South Dakota. Not New York, not California, not Delaware, South Dakota. And I thought, why in the world would the largest banks in America in the world be registering there? And the reason is because South Dakota decided, hey, we want to attract financial institutions, so we're going to change our laws. We're going to make our state banking laws the most banking oriented in the country, and we're going to use that as a magnet and try to attract business. And it worked remarkably well. So that's a great example of how what we're talking about here that Catawba has done is a proven concept where regulations that are made not just for the purpose of monitoring, but also for the purpose of enhancing economic activity, can really make a difference and actually succeed. So this is something that we advocate for strongly. With regard to the tribal public bank, and now we'll start getting specific into that, as we were discussing a minute ago, it has always been exceptionally difficult for tribal members, people living on reservation and around reservation communities, to get access to basic financial services and to have access to capital to do the things that most people are able to take for granted. It is extremely difficult, if not impossible, for most tribal members living on reservations to get a mortgage from a bank to buy a home or to build a house on the reservation. It is extremely difficult for an entrepreneur to get a small business loan or line of credit to open a business on the reservation. Part of that has to do with the geography, part of it has to do with the separation from the markets, part of it has to do, a big part of it, with fear on the part of commercial lending institutions of doing business in tribal communities because they know tribes are different. They know that jurisdiction is separate from what they're used to dealing with in states. They don't really understand how, why it's different, or what they can do to address issues of risk that make it actually very profitable for them to do business if they want to. So they just don't bother. So, what we're looking at as a goal of the tribal bank, and we'll talk in detail about it, is we've got to close that gap. If the commercial banks aren't going to be there, then the tribe can set up its own bank and assist its own people in getting access to capital so that they can do these basic things. They can buy a house, they can get a car, they can open a business, all of which are desperately needed in every reservation in America because we're so far behind the local communities in that regard because there hasn't been access to capital. So the public bank is in a position to do that once it becomes operational. It can also become a leader of economic development. It can offer loans and guarantees for outside businesses to attract them to come and open a store or a factory or whatever the case may be in the tribal community and have financial support there locally to do it and mitigate their risk. And so we're looking at the tribal bank not only as a governmental institution for regulatory purposes, but the public bank provides access to capital to those who have been underserved and left out of the financial system, and to create new opportunities for a virtuous economic cycle to build up. So we'll go now into the specifics of what is on the ground and building up today. In 2023, the Catawba Nation adopted, through its legislative process, the very first tribal banking and financial services code in the United States of America. This code looks a lot in terms of its structure like a typical banking code that you would see at the state level or the federal chartering level. It is designed to be comprehensive and cover all aspects of financial services and give the tribe the ability to regulate traditional banking, all aspects of finance, and in the emerging financial technologies, digital assets, and things we're reading about that are evolving constantly. And a particular section of the Catawba Nation's Tribal Banking and Financial Services Code is the authorization and the legal foundations and procedures for the first ever tribal public bank, which is under the supervision of the Catawba Banking Commission. So here's some of the specifics. The public bank of the Catawba Nation is established under Chapter 17 of Regulation number 004-23. It is operated and governed by the Catawba Banking Commission, and one of its jobs is to issue charters to other banks and financial institutions that wish to operate within the nation. So, in addition to establishing itself as a bank through these regulations, the public bank is designed to be the Fed or the DFI of the Catawba Nation. And what they do is they provide licenses to existing banks or to enterprises that want to form a new bank. You can now charter for the first time in a tribal jurisdiction. So previously, you could either get a federal charter for your bank or one or more state charters, depending on where you operate. The Catawba are now the first tribal nation to be able to issue a banking charter so that the bank is registered and domiciled and operates out of the Catawba Nation. And a lot of what's in the Catawba Banking Code has a similar approach to what South Dakota put into its banking code. Certainly robust regulation from an oversight section, but getting rid of red tape, getting rid of the things that banks don't like and why they avoid certain states in terms of registering, putting in the things that really are attractive in an efficiency sense so that they are now getting banks that have come in. And at the end of the presentation, I've got websites for you to take a look at Catawba that will show you some of the banks who have already registered there. So, what are the purposes of the Catawba Nation's Tribal Public Bank? The first fundamental purpose is going back to the things that we talked about at the beginning, the philosophy, the political economy, and sovereignty application. They want to promote the strength of their nation and their economy. They want to attract business and make that economy grow. They want to provide for access to capital and close that gap that we've discussed for their tribal members so that they can get access to things that the rest of us have, and to strengthen the communities as a result. One of the things that is a constant issue, and this isn't tribal specific, it happens all over the world in different places, but it always happens with tribes, is because there is a chronic lack of opportunity economically. Members of the tribe, when they get old enough, they move. They go out to the cities. Most Native Americans in America actually don't live on the reservation. They live in Seattle. They live in Los Angeles. They live in the big cities because that's where the jobs are. And so the tribes lose the benefit of their members. And what the public bank is doing as part of its mission is trying to create opportunity so that people will stay, or people who've gone out and gotten job skills and gotten other resources will come home and work in the Catawba community, which strengthens it generationally. The other thing that they are focused on doing, or second thing, is partnering with the federal government in particular and private enterprises to create economic opportunities. And we'll look at some of the specifics there. But basically, there's a lot of economic activity that can and does happen between tribal governments and the federal government, but it's often not coordinated. It's sort of happening in different silos and not necessarily as part of a strategic plan. The tribal public bank is designed to say, how do we maximize that relationship? How do we leverage the fact that we have this special channel to the federal government and these programs and opportunities that are based on economic development? Let's get strategic about that. Let's look at it in a comprehensive plan and use it to create opportunities. And then ultimately, what they want to do operationally is be efficient and be able to make things happen. You know, it's one thing to have the theories and to say that we're sovereign and to have things on paper, but the public bank at Catawba is designed to produce results. They want people to get mortgages. They want to see new buildings being built. They want to see roads and infrastructure, and they want to see businesses. So they are designing their operational systems to do that efficiently with an eye to delivering those things. So what can the Catawba Tribal Public Bank do? And this comes straight out of the regulations. We're summarizing what you'll see if you go and read the entirety of the code through those links. But the tribal public bank can do anything that any other bank can do. So it is designed to operate as a bank, not necessarily replacing other banks or being the sole bank that operates in a way within the jurisdiction, but to supplement it for sure and to try to close those gaps. But it has the ability legally to operate as any bank does and to take on any lines of business that appear beneficial. It has the opportunity to join and participate in governmental and private financial systems and programs. So the tribal public bank is going to have a Fed master account. It's going to be connected into the FDIC. It's going to be working with the Department of Treasury, the comptroller of the currency, and is going to be participating in all of the different federal financial systems so that it's fully integrated, like a state would be, into all of the things that are there that you need to in order to have a robust and growing financial system. And the tribal public bank is designed to be the primary interface with the expertise to be able to do that effectively. And then the public bank has a regulatory function. It establishes and monitors the requirements for the other financial institutions, the private banks that have come and registered in the Catawba Nation. They are the overseers. They are the Fed or the FDIC locally there, working in conjunction with those federal agencies in partnership. So they are operating on the ground and making sure that what's happening within the Catawba Nation they know about, and they're ahead of the game on those issues that end up sometimes going bad. What are some of the other things that the tribal public bank is designed to do business-wise? Tribal governments typically handle large sums of money throughout the year. They get money for housing, they get money for healthcare, for education, for all different kinds of purposes. Tribal enterprises like casinos, if one has one, make money. So there's a lot of revenue that can come in. Almost every tribe in that country takes their money and puts it into somebody else's bank. And you get some interest when you do that. But of course, the bank that you put your money in gets more. They do better than you do on your money. So, what the tribal public bank is designed to do is to keep that money in house and to have it so that the tribe and its community gets the full benefit of the money that goes through banking every year and is able to leverage that back for the purposes within Catawba. It is designed to close that gap on mortgages, car loans, and business loans and provide direct loans to tribal members and enterprises. And this is really critical because when you go to the communities, one of the things that's mentioned is go to a reservation and see if you can get a haircut. Most reservations in the country, you can't. There's nobody there who's delivering that kind of basic service that everybody needs, but there's nobody there who can do it because they don't have the resources. The public bank at Catawba is designed to offer that kind of funding and financing on terms that make sense and to take advantage of some programs offered by the federal government that we'll highlight in just a minute. They also have a special mission called the Sovereign Lands Fund. You saw that the Catawba Nation's current territory, it's right there on that border area of North and South Carolina. That is a minuscule fraction of the land that the Catawba Nation used to live upon. going back to time immemorial. And so, like all tribes, there is a goal to reclaim land, put land back into tribal ownership, and put it to work for the tribal community, their ancestral lands, their places where they have culturally significant resources. So the public bank is designed to help with that because typically the way tribes are reclaiming land these days is they buy it, just like anybody else does, out on the market, and that takes capital to do. So the public bank has a specific mission to facilitate that. They also have a very public facing mission. It's not just about economics and trying to create revenue or business activity. It's also human security oriented and providing gaps or filling the gaps for things that cost money but don't necessarily make money. So they have a special mission section on health, providing funding to develop health technology, health clinics, the things that are needed for all of us to be able to access. Because right now it's a pretty far distance for people who live on the Catawba Reservation to get to a hospital, for example. So they need more primary care. They need the best that they can get in technology. The Carolinas are in hurricane country. I've known some people who've lived out there and had to evacuate numerous times when the weather gets the way that it's kind of in Washington state right now. Um, there's a lot that has to happen. Insurance is very difficult, just as banking is in tribal communities. And if your property is damaged, it can be very difficult to get the funding necessary to get it restored. So emergency rebuilding loans at low or no interest, something the public bank will offer and provide in those situations so that people can get their lives back together. Educational savings plans, 529 plans. Education, in my opinion, is the key to the future for everyone. The more educated a person and community are, the more opportunity they will have. Typically, tribes, just as they've been left out of every other financial service, very rarely are targeted for the big names in the financial services industry for 529 plans. So the tribal public bank will close that gap. They will offer direct plans potentially, but initially bringing in connections with established plans and be able to connect through education the tribal members to say, hey, here's what this is. Here's why this is important for you to think about and a good investment for your future, your children's future. And the other thing is using, again, the idea of digital technology, the internet, electronic funds transmission, and other forms of electronic banking and financial services. That's really the future for tribes because of what we said at the very beginning. There are no brick and mortar banks out there. There's no place like you used to be able to roll up in Snohomish and do your banking. They don't have that. So they need to be digital. Everybody's got a phone. And if you've got a phone, then today you're able to do pretty much everything you want to do financially if you're connected, if you have an account, if you understand how all of that works. So the Tribal Public Bank has a mission to implement those systems and educate tribal members on how to use those systems safely and efficiently for their purposes to overcome those geographic boundaries. So we talked earlier about the reluctance of banks in the commercial sector and other financial institutions to go out and do loans and provide access to capital in tribal communities. One thing that the tribal public bank will use itself and will be publicizing for attracting other banks, and this has already succeeded because they have other banks who are there now, is a special resource that we created in-house, and this was led by the person who is now the banking commissioner, the director of the Catawba Bank Commissioner, Professor Phil Viles. He is a former director of the Federal Indian Loan Guarantee Program. That is a program that the federal government says to banks, if you will do a loan for a tribal member on reservation, the government will back that loan. So you're worried about your risk. You're worried they may not pay you back. What are you going to do? You don't understand the tribal realm. You don't have to. You get a guarantee from the federal government. If they don't pay, we'll pay. Just call us up, tell us what happened. We'll send you a check. You're fully secured. So this is a great program. There's a general one through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Department of Interior. That's the one that Professor Viles ran. But almost every agency of the federal government has some tribal-oriented program like that, but nobody knows about them. The banks don't know about them. Tribal members don't know about them because these things aren't publicized. They're scattered all over the place. There was no one-stop place that you could find out about this and say, hey, I want a small business loan. How can I get a guarantee to take to my bank and get the money? Catawba created that one-stop resource. We did the research with all of the federal agencies that have tribal financial support programs, compiled a list of all of the things they offer in terms of loan guarantees and other types of credit support, and all of the places you have to go, what the application things are. And so all of that's in one spot now. And what the tribal public bank can do is they can go to these constituent banks, the commercial side that are operating, and say, hey, we would like you to help this business or help these people with their loans. If you will provide them with the loan, we will go get you the federal guarantee. We know how to do it. We know who to talk to. We know the people directly. So you bank will be fully secured. You don't have anything to worry about. You don't even have to fill out the paperwork. Just do your loan paperwork the way you normally do. We'll take it to the federal agency that's pertinent for this type of loan. Maybe it's the USDA for a rural small business loan. Maybe it's HUD for a home mortgage on a tribal program. We'll get you the guarantee and you're good to go. So closing that gap on access to capital, because realistically, a tribal public bank is not going to be able to give everybody a loan who needs one. The Fed doesn't do that. No one bank can do that. It takes a community of financial institutions to do it. But the tribal public bank can be the focal point and can be the resource that makes that happen and brings in these other elements of capital so that people can do it. So I'm going to wrap up my comments here now and give you a couple of websites that are going to go into all the current detail for what we've been discussing. The first is the website for the Catawba Digital Economic Zone. So this is the special economic jurisdiction that was created a couple of years ago with the legislation that we worked on together and became the first tribal digital economic zone, as you think of it as a free enterprise zone. And the tribal public bank operates within that zone, as do the other businesses that Catawba has attracted. And you'll see a lot of interesting information about who's working there now. The second one at the bottom is the link for the full Tribal Banking and Financial Services Code that was adopted by the Catawba Nation. It is the 100+ pages of legislation. So you can see all of the things that they have covered and are now regulating. And within there, you will see the section on the tribal public bank, and it provides all of the legal detail on the powers of the bank, the mission of the bank, and how they conduct their business. And this is my last slide. This is my information. So welcome all of your comments, both tonight in the time that we have remaining, and then I'd love to keep the conversation going. I'm tremendously grateful and just honored to be able to connect with Washingtonians for Public Banking. I think your idea and mission is right on for what needs to be happening, and I'd love to be a source of support and resource for you and talk more about what we're doing both on the tribal side and in any other way I can help. So please jot any of this down and reach out to me anytime, and delighted to talk further. So Marco, I'll wrap it up there and we can go to questions. And if people want to go back to any slides, I'm happy to do that. I can keep the slideshow up for now.
Thank you. We really appreciate this. And I will say that other speakers have shared with us their slide deck, as Dr. Goodall has. And we emailed them to the participants who registered for the meeting. So everyone who's appeared today, I can give you a copy of these slides. I also, I just want to thank you again and also want to plug our organization. You started with talking about the decline of a lot of rural community banks. And our organization actually just produced a report on this last month, where we talked about how it's occurring in here in Washington. And just to put it out there, we have less than 39 banks that are chartered in the state or federally chartered but headquartered in the state. Our banking market here in Washington is overwhelmingly dominated by out-of-state mega banks, and that's true for a lot of states. But we have some time for questions, so I will just leave it open. If you want to ask a question to Dr. Goodall, please use the raise the hand feature in Zoom, or you can put a question in the chat. And so I do see something from Cynthia. Cynthia, I see you posted something in chat. Do you want to ask your question?
Okay, so I can read Cynthia's
Yeah.
question. It says, are we saying that Chase Bank or whoever has a branch on the reservation? So Chase definitely does not have a branch on the reservation. Text.
Oh, it looks like you cut out.
Can you hear
Oh,
me?
go ahead. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, you cut out
okay.
for a minute.
So the Catawba Digital Economic Zone is a very small piece of land. We talked about how they had to start over from ground zero in the 1990s. So they are trying to build out a land base, but their land base right now is very small. So there is not a brick and mortar bank branch there. What has occurred in the Digital Economic Zone is banks have registered to do business there. So you will see if you go on those websites at the end of the presentation, and they are now operating from the Catawba zone digitally. So they don't have a physical presence, but they have a legal presence, a domicile presence there. What the nation in general and what the tribal public bank in particular are now going to do with these banks is they connect them with the local population and they say, here are tribal members who have business needs, they have mortgage needs, whatever the particular issue may be. Let's see how we can work together to help them. So, even in the absence, thankfully, with the technology we have today, in the absence of a brick and mortar bank, you can still get things done digitally. You know, with e-signatures and all of that, it's really not necessary for most banking things to physically go into a branch anymore. But you have to have a bank that's willing to work with you. And that's what's happening in the digital economic zone with the banks that have registered there. They are working remotely and connecting through technology with the community to build that local base of business while they continue to conduct their other business outside the Catawba zone. You ask what banks have registered. Take a look at the websites at the end of the presentation. They've got the up-to-date information and they've got a mailing list if you want to get on and get updates on things that happen. They're really good at publicizing the developments. And when they get new businesses that come in, they issue press releases. So a lot of interesting information that comes out. I see another
Well,
question from
I think we
HB
have two
Kimberly.
ahead of that too.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go. We have a kind of a list of people. So first is
Go ahead.
Kimberly, and then it's Christy, and then we'll do Howard.
Okay.
Kimberly, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. It sounds like the Catawba Bank only serves tribal members of the Catawba Nation. And if that is the case, I'm wondering if there is interest among other tribes to establish their own public bank that will serve their tribal members.
Uh, yeah, so no and yes. No, in that it's certainly true that the tribal public bank at Catawba is focused on that community, but they are not restricted to only serving tribal members. They are certainly open. The Catawba, like all tribes, sit within a broader community and they have connections outside their reservation boundaries. And in fact, most people, because their reservation is so small, they live in the area, but not on the land of the reservation. So the all of the Catawba businesses are naturally operating beyond that. The code that was developed, the Banking and Financial Services Code, and adopted by Catawba was always intended to also serve as a model tribal banking code. And one of the articles that's on the slideshow at the beginning, you'll see that in there. And the idea was every tribe should be at least thinking about this. And there are many tribes who can do exactly what Catawba has done. Catawba's the first actor, right? Everyone's always afraid to be first. But once you get somebody who's willing to go for it and do something, then things start to open up. So the Catawba have actually been visited numerous times, and I'm sure continuously, by people from other tribes who know about this, who have come and say, we're interested in this too. And it's to Catawba's credit that they are very open in sharing information. They see a real opportunity in cross-jurisdictional banking with other tribes. If the Cherokee,
Yeah.
if the Spokane, if all over the country we could get things like this set up, they can coordinate together. They can pool resources and serve communities in a coordinated way, which is a big time, long term, strategic idea. But Catawba is very, very interested in that. So, absolutely yes to your question that the code that exists provides any tribe that would like to adapt it to their own particular situation the basis to do that and to adopt their own regulation to start being in sovereign control over their financial sector. And we're pushing that out and encouraging it. And there are a lot of tribes who are currently looking to do it.
And then next
I'm
up we
really
have,
pleased to
oh,
hear that. Thank
sorry.
you.
Oh, okay.
I'm
Next up,
just saying, I'm really pleased to hear that. And I used to live 3 miles from the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. And what you said about being remote, I mean, it's so remote from any place that would have a bank. So it desperately needs something like this. Thank you.
Thank you.
and then next up we have a very similar question from Christy, which writes, can non-Indians set up accounts and get loans from a tribal bank?
Absolutely. And the conditions for doing that, and you would have a process there that would be standardized as far as the information. It would look a lot like you would see at any other bank. Certainly for the Catawba Public Bank, and let me separate out. So we have the Catawba Public Bank, but then we have other commercial banks, already established banks that are not tribal as far as their ownership, but they have registered and are now operating from Catawba. Okay. So the Catawba Tribal Bank, its mission is certainly to focus on building the economy for its tribal citizens. It's not exclusive in that regard, but that's where most of their ideas are going to be focused. So if you were in the local area but you weren't tribal, absolutely. If you were going to do a business that's got some kind of sort of general economic effect that's going to be beneficial, they would be very interested in that. But for the other banks, the commercial banks that have registered at Catawba, they're open to bank with anybody. So you certainly could work with one of the Catawba domiciled banks that's not owned by the nation itself. It's not a public bank, but is connected to that community and certainly is sharing the mission and the understanding of the need for access to capital and closing these gaps to the underserved communities, tribal and rural. So there would certainly be plenty of opportunity for people who are not Catawba tribal members to be banking with Catawba financial institutions.
And then we have a
Thank
question
you.
from Howard. Um, Howard writes, how does the Catawba accumulate its own capital?
Right. Numerous different sources. So we mentioned that the Catawba Nation, the government of the tribe, has funds from a number of different sources. Some of those come from the federal government, some of them come from their own just governmental savings. They do have tribally owned business enterprises that the tribe itself owns and operates, and they get capital from those sources. So it is a mixture of different types of or different lines of capital that are coming in. Some of it is for strictly governmental purposes. Some of it is for commercial purposes. It's basically discretionary money that they can apply where they want to apply. But the idea is instead of taking all of those sources of capital, which in the past would have gone out to different banks off the reservation, non-tribally owned, no real interest in doing anything with the tribe other than taking its money. Now that money's staying home, And so the amount of capital that is available to access or to leverage and put to work in the Catawba community exponentially greater than in the past. And that's a model that we're also encouraging other tribes to think about is, how much money are you putting out every year to somebody else's bank? And what would that look like for you if you were keeping that close to home and putting it to work on your priorities rather than some commercial bank?
And then we have a question from Ruth, and I just want to recognize that Ruth is one of our board members here at Washingtonians for Public Banking. And she writes, some tribes have credit unions. What advantages do a tribal public bank have compared to a credit union?
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. And credit unions are a great way in a lot of communities to try to bridge some of these gaps. And you are correct. There are credit unions with some tribes. I think it's very few just in general. So there's certainly still the huge need. Credit unions typically focus on certain lines of business. They do certain types of loans, and they've got a mandate and limits that are based on how they're chartered. So they fill a very important lane, but it's a limited lane. The tribal public bank is unlimited in its range of activities potentially that it is authorized to do. And if it wants to do something that is beyond what a credit union would have in its charter and operational mandate to do, it can do that. So, for example, a credit union may not offer an emergency reconstruction loan for houses that are destroyed in hurricanes. They may not offer funding to provide for a new health clinic to be built because those aren't really commercial activities, but they're obviously fundamental economic and social activities for the community. But the tribal public bank can do that. So if you had credit unions or other banks operating in a tribal jurisdiction that were doing those kinds of typical things that they do, I would see that as freeing up the tribal public bank to work in other areas of need and see, okay, what are these institutions not handling that would be beneficial for our people or the general economy? Let's go after that business. Let's focus in those areas. So having that broad mandate, really unlimited, and being able to focus wherever the need is, that gives the tribal bank a lot of flexibility that other commercial organizations don't have because they have to be more focused. But they can work together.
Okay. Thank you again. I think that's our final question. We go to little Greg Duddle. Uh, and I just want to remind everyone that there will be a copy recording of this presentation on our YouTube, so you can share it with your friends. It'll be up there shortly. So thanks again, everyone. If you haven't already, please sign up for our newsletter and visit our website, and we will inform you about future events like this one. So thanks
Thanks,
again for your
everybody.
time.
And
Take
thank you,
care.
Marco. I had a wonderful time with everyone. And please reach out if I can help with anything.
Terrific, terrific. Glad to hear it.
All right. Bye bye, everyone.
Bye.